Hi, in this short video, we're going to talk about how you can encourage deep student learning by asking strategic questions. So the questions should always carefully match your learning objective for the day. So think about what things do you want your students to learn in your lesson? What specifically will you do to encourage that learning? Your questions should guide and prompt your students through their learning objectives for that day. Your questions should be very strategic. That means that you should be clear. Your students don't want to be confused. You should be purposeful in the questions that you're asking. You should be brief. Don't give long-winded questions. Don't give these. If you give 5 questions, if you give 10 questions, if you give paragraph-long questions, especially at the middle school level, your students might get confused. Your question should have a type of sequence. Sometimes it might be from simpler task to harder task. Sometimes it might be from level 1 depth of knowledge on up to eventually level 3 depth of knowledge or level 4 depth of knowledge, for instance. Sometimes it might be sequenced on up through the cognitive levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And your question should be thought-provoking, especially if you want your students to think at higher levels of depth of knowledge. You want to know your why. Your why of your question determines what your question will be, of course. Are you asking your question for the purpose of motivating your students? Well, then you should be asking inquiry-based questions. You should be trying to pique their curiosity. Are you trying to stimulate critical thinking? In that case, you would ask more analytical, synthesis and analysis type questions. Are you trying to assess their understanding of a concept? Well, if you're trying to assess their understanding of a concept, now you can go in terms of range. It's okay to ask for instance, level 1 depth of knowledge question if you're simply trying to assess, do you recall a certain question? Assessment can be of various types along Bloom's taxonomy or depth of knowledge. Are you trying to guide a discussion? Well, if you're trying to guide a discussion, then your question should be of the type that furthers discourse among your students. And you don't want to ask a question, then 2 seconds later you give the answer. Count to 5, for instance, in your head, or even 10, if you're trying to get used to not asking questions too fast and inhibiting thought that way. Your question should not be confusing to your students. Your question should be direct to what you want to ask, and it should be understandable among the students. The language should be simple as appropriate for the grade level and age level of your students, and they should be appropriate for the topic that you want them to think about. Don't ask a bunch of questions that take them away from what you want your students to think about for learning objectives, and then all of a sudden remember, oh my gosh, I have to backtrack. Now I have to recenter the learning. Your questions should be appropriate. They should be guided. They should be strategic. They should be relevant to the topic you're teaching about. Your questions can, especially if you're doing problem-based learning or project-based learning, encourage an exploration of ideas. They can encourage creative thinking. They can help students see relationship between various ideas and concepts. Synthesis, for instance. Your questions can guide students toward wanting to apply new knowledge or practice new knowledge. Work in a meaningful context, explore relationship, works in groups, right? Apply prior knowledge. How does something that I learned yesterday apply to this new knowledge that I'm learning today? Your questions can encourage inquiry, investigation, as well as problem solving. It's okay to vary the sequence of your questions. Sometimes that might be inquiry-based, in which you're trying to guide students through the application of the scientific method. Sometimes they might guide students through simple concepts on up to more complex concepts. The point is you want to have a plan. Strategically work your way through the depth of knowledge. Remember what we learned about Norman Webb's depth of knowledge. You might start with level 1 recall type questions, check for understanding. You strategically work your way on up through skill type questions. You ask them to graph, you have them classify. Now you work your way to the strategic thinking. This is when you might have them revise, you might have them critique. Then level 4, the extended thinking. This is when you have them design something, or you form connections, or you synthesize. Be sure to plan your questions ahead of time. It's okay, of course, to ask students questions that come to your head during the lesson, obviously. But I strongly encourage you to plan questions ahead of time that are very strategic and very sequential for your students. We'll focus during this video on the cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy. Remember that there are 3 domains, of course: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. You can get into the psychomotor domain by having students move, be multisensory. Reader's Theater, for instance, does that very well. Reader's Theater, you can combine fluency with comprehension with the psychomotor domain. With the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy, you can ask students to make value judgments. Do you think that what a certain character did was morally right or wrong? How do you feel about something? What's an emotional connection you make with something that you were just reading? That's where you would get into the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy. But for now, I'm going to focus on the cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy. When you focus on the knowledge domain in Bloom's taxonomy, you would ask students direct questions that require them to recall information or to recognize information. This is basic facts. Then when you get into comprehension, you ask students questions that require them to restate something, not just simply verbatim. For instance, if they were reading a short passage, can they restate that passage in their own words? Can they retell that passage in their own words? That gets into comprehension type questions. You might ask them to give examples where they demonstrate their understanding of information. So if they were reading about mitosis, can you explain the process of mitosis in your own words when you're reading about science? Then we get into application. Application deals with questions that require students to solve a problem by applying their learning to a particular situation. For instance, look at the following graph. Paragraph. Can you identify the use of active verbs that you saw in that paragraph? That's if you're teaching students, for instance, the difference between active and passive. Analysis questions deal with asking students to find patterns, make comparison and contrast, or find analogies. How is X like Z? Can you determine the argument that the author is making based upon evidence? Then you can ask students to synthesize. This is where you require students to use their original thought to create and solve a problem while drawing on background knowledge. Then they can evaluate. This requires students to make judgments according to appropriate criteria that they're given about the value of a work, or about the quality of an idea, or about whether a certain problem-solving method is going to work or not, for instance. Then we get into creativity. Too oftentimes we neglect creativity. This is where you have students deal with creative writing, or creation of art, or digital storytelling, or problem-based learning, where they're creating something new while drawing on background knowledge and applying their skill. I want you to pre-plan your question, like I said earlier. What knowledge and skills do you need your students to learn? This will form the basis of questions that you would ask. When you think about pace, the type of questions that you're asking and the way you're asking the questions, whether it's the tone or the wait time, or whether you're asking a student to analyze or recall, that gets into your question that you want to ask, because you can easily speed up or slow down a lesson based upon the questions that you're asking. What will be the areas where your students are possibly going to struggle? And you can ask questions appropriately based upon your anticipated struggles. How will you tie your learning objectives into previous background knowledge? Well, your questions can guide you in that area. Think about how to teach and ask questions according to certain vocabulary. You can strategically use students' vocabulary knowledge from their everyday lived experience. That's Tier 1 vocabulary, to use that as a bridge toward Tier 2 vocabulary. Tier 2 vocabulary would be academic vocabulary that's common in multiple disciplinary areas. So you're trying to build background knowledge using Tier 1 as a bridge oftentimes. Then you get into Tier 3 vocabulary. Tier 3 vocabulary would be vocabulary that is specific to the exact discipline that you teach. Vocabulary that is very specific to, let's say, science. The word mitosis would be an example of Tier 3 vocabulary, very specific to science. Be explicit in your instruction and explicit in your questions related to vocabulary instruction. You want to use questioning techniques. For instance, I've given you some examples here that I want to watch. I especially want to encourage you to, even if you skip one of these links, please watch the Anita Archer one. Anita Archer is an expert in the field of explicit instruction. Please watch that. If you're teaching a literary unit and you're having students read a work of fiction, I've given you some examples of some questions that you can ask your students either in writing or verbally as they're reading this work of fiction. Here are some examples of some good guiding questions you can ask as students read nonfiction. I want you to be very strategic in having students think about what are the author's intentions, for instance, as they understand the meaning of this passage. This is drawing on work by Beck and McKeon out of University of Pittsburgh, Isabel Beck. After your lesson, be very strategic about your reflections. What might you want to reteach? Did you plan your lesson accordingly based upon the time it took to complete activities? Did you students make adequate learning gains or not? Why or why not? And all of this feeds into the topic questions you might ask the next day.